I inherited an old garage from my husband, and my son inherited our luxurious house. When he found out, he called me a useless old woman and kicked me out of the house. So I decided to spend the night in the garage. But when I opened it, I was paralyzed. The heavy silence in the notary's office was broken only by the low hum of the air conditioner. Eleanor Whitman sat stiffly in the high-backed leather chair, her hands folded on her lap, aged knuckles pale with tension. At 68 years old, she had known grief, had seen it dressed in many forms, but nothing prepared her for the weight of this day. The polished mahogany table before her seemed colder than the autumn wind blowing through the Oregon streets outside. To her right sat her son, Brandon Whitman, a man of 39 with sharp features, crisp designer clothes, and a perpetual air of entitlement. He looked irritated to be there, scrolling on his phone as if the reading of his late father's will were just another tedious meeting. Eleanor did not look at him. She had not exchanged more than 5 sentences with him since Richard's funeral, and even those had been obligatory. The notary, Mr. Grant, an older gentleman with a soft voice and graying temples, cleared his throat as he adjusted his glasses. "Thank you for coming today. This won't take long." Richard left very specific instructions regarding the distribution of his estate. Eleanor glanced at the framed photo on the corner of the desk, a younger Mr. Grant beside a fishing boat, likely from a different lifetime. She wondered briefly what life would feel like without the tightness in her chest, the constant ache of absence. As per the last will and testament of Richard Alton Whitman, Mr. Grant continued, dated 6 months prior to his passing, the following assets are to be distributed accordingly. Brandon leaned back, exhaling, already imagining the luxury that awaited him. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Not from hope, but from fear of what she had suspected ever since Richard fell ill and started spending long hours alone, often disappearing into the garage behind the house, a place he always kept locked. To Brandon Charles Whitman, sole heir and son of the deceased, is bequeathed the Whitman family residence located at 347 Oak Ridge Drive, along with its contents, and full ownership of the property and surrounding lands. Brandon smirked. As expected. Eleanor said nothing, her eyes fixed on the notary's mouth as he continued reading. To Eleanor Margaret Whitman, wife of the deceased for 43 years, is bequeathed the detached structure at the rear of the Oak Ridge property, commonly referred to as the Bold Garage, and its entire contents. Additionally, a personal savings account in her name, containing $25,000, is to be released immediately. Silence. Brandon blinked. Wait. What? Just the garage? Eleanor felt her body stiffen. Her throat burned, but she kept her expression composed. Is that all? She asked softly. Mr. Grant nodded gently. Yes. Those were Richard's wishes, clearly stated and notarized. Brandon slammed his hand on the table, startling both Mr. Grant and Eleanor. This is insane. She gets the garage? What does that even mean? That place is useless. Eleanor finally turned to him, her eyes tired but clear. Your father had his reasons. He scoffed. He must have lost his mind near the end. That garage is full of junk. You live in that house for almost half a century and walk away with a shed? That's all you're worth to him? Mr. Grant shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Whitman, I assure you. No, Brandon cut him off, his voice rising. She manipulated him. That's what happened. You poisoned his mind, didn't you, Mom? Eleanor said nothing. There were 100 things she could have said, about loyalty, sacrifice, the nights spent worrying while Richard built their life from the ground up. But none of it mattered to Brandon now. She could see it in his face. He saw her not as a mother, not even as a woman, but as an obstacle to be rid of. I don't want her in that house anymore, he said suddenly, turning to Mr. Grant. Can I do that? Evict her? She doesn't own it. Mr. Grant opened his mouth, clearly trying to tread carefully. Technically, the property now belongs to you, yes. But I would urge. I'll give her 24 hours, Brandon snapped. She can take her boxes of memories and move into her precious garage. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply nodded to Mr. Grant and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Brandon called after her. "You really gonna sleep with the rats tonight?" She paused, hand on the doorknob, then turned her head just enough for him to hear. "If that garage was good enough for your father to keep locked for over 40 years, then maybe it's worth more than you'll ever understand." And with that, Eleanor walked out of the office, the echo of her heels against the polished floor the only sound left in the room. Outside, the wind bit at her face, the clouds heavy with impending rain. She stood for a long moment under the gray sky, eyes closed, heart pounding. She had lost Richard. She had lost her home. And now, she was left with a garage she had never stepped inside. But something in her, something buried and quiet, told her that Richard had left her more than she realized. Much more. She walked home without a word, determined to face the darkness behind that locked door. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, she would open it. Eleanor returned to the house later that afternoon, her legs aching from the long walk and her mind clouded by an exhaustion that went deeper than physical. The wind had picked up, carrying with it a chill that clung to her coat and crept beneath the collar of her blouse. As she stepped through the back gate of the property, she looked up at the vast silhouette of the house she had called home for over 4 decades. Its windows stared back at her like empty eyes, cold and indifferent. She entered through the side door, careful not to make noise. Old habit. Even after Richard passed, she still moved through the house with a quiet deference, like a guest rather than the woman who had raised a family within these walls. She placed her purse on the small entry table, removed her scarf, and paused. Brandon's voice echoed from the living room. "She's back." Eleanor stepped into view. Brandon was pacing, still in his designer slacks, tie loosened but not removed. He held a glass of scotch in one hand, likely his second or third, and wore an expression twisted between irritation and disbelief. "I thought you were staying out," he said, gesturing toward the door. "Didn't think you'd have the guts to come back after that joke of a will." Eleanor walked past him without a word and made her way toward the stairs. "Oh, come on," he scoffed, following her. "You're really going to pretend like this is normal? That I'm just going to let you stroll around here like nothing's changed?" "I'm packing," she said simply, not looking at him. "Packing for what?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Moving into the garage? Do you even know if it has heat? Or plumbing? Or do you plan to survive off spiders and regrets?" Eleanor stopped halfway up the staircase and turned to face him. Her expression remained composed, but the sharpness in her eyes cut through the air. "It's none of your concern." Brandon laughed bitterly. "You really think this is what Dad wanted? You in that garage and me taking care of everything else?" He must have been delusional. She continued climbing without responding. Brandon shouted after her, "You manipulated him. Don't think I don't see it. All those months when he got sick, always with you. Whispering. Making plans." Eleanor paused at the top of the stairs. "You were barely here." "What? You stopped visiting when he needed you most. You couldn't even look him in the eye the last month." Brandon stormed up after her. "So now I'm the bad son, is that it? You're going to turn this whole thing around on me?" "No," she replied. "You did that yourself." The words hung between them, thick and final. Brandon stood frozen for a moment, jaw clenched, then turned abruptly and stomped back downstairs. Eleanor heard the clink of glass as he refilled his drink. She closed the door to the master bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the drawer of the nightstand. Inside were photographs, old cards, and keepsakes she had meant to sort through someday. She stared at them for a long time, then pulled out a worn leather suitcase from the closet and began placing her things inside, quietly, methodically, as if the act of folding sweaters and wrapping perfume bottles in scarves could dull the pain rising inside her chest. By evening, she had finished packing the essentials, a week's worth of clothes, toiletries, her journal, and 2 framed photographs, one of Richard and one of Brandon when he was just 5 years old, standing beside his father in front of a treehouse they'd built together. She hesitated before placing the second photo in her bag, but she took it anyway. Downstairs, she found Brandon asleep on the couch, the bottle of scotch nearly empty beside him. She did not wake him. She walked past the fireplace, past the rug they had chosen together in a Portland antique store 30 years ago, past the dining table that had hosted countless family dinners, birthdays, and holidays. Each step away from those memories felt like a quiet death. The garage key was in her coat pocket. Richard had given it to her 2 years earlier without explanation, only saying, "You'll know when it's time." She hadn't thought about it again until the reading of the will. Outside, the wind had intensified. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter around her as she crossed the yard toward the dark silhouette of the garage. She paused once to glance back at the house, its windows now glowing faintly from the light inside. It looked foreign to her now. Not a home, but a hollow monument to a life she was no longer part of. She unlocked the padlock and pulled the heavy door open, but didn't step inside. Not yet. She would need time, not just to enter, but to prepare herself for whatever was waiting on the other side. She turned back and saw Brandon standing at the porch, watching her. "You're really doing this," he called out, his voice groggy and slurred. "Living in that tomb?" "I am," she said. He threw his arms up. "You're insane." She locked eyes with him. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just finally free." He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, more a bitter noise that fell flat in the wind. "Don't come crawling back when you realize there's nothing in there but dust and disappointment." Eleanor didn't answer. She stepped inside the garage and pulled the door shut behind her. Brandon stood there for another minute, as if expecting her to emerge again and admit she had made a mistake. When she didn't, he cursed under his breath, turned, and slammed the porch door behind him. Inside the garage, Eleanor sat on an old wooden stool and let her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through a high, grimy window. The air smelled of oil and wood, old, but not unpleasant. She looked around without moving. Shadows hinted at shapes and boxes. Tools hung on walls. A workbench stood beneath a dusty lamp. Everything was still. Silent. She would explore tomorrow. Tonight, she would sleep. On the cold, hard floor of the only thing she now owned. Not out of defeat, but out of quiet defiance. The morning light filtered in through the grimy window panes, casting soft shafts of golden light across the garage's dusty floor. Eleanor woke slowly, her joints stiff from the unforgiving concrete beneath her. She had wrapped herself in an old wool blanket she found in a trunk near the back wall. It offered little warmth, but enough comfort to keep the cold from her bones. She sat up carefully, letting her eyes adjust to the surroundings she had barely noticed the night before. As her vision cleared, the full interior of the garage came into focus, and with it, the moment that changed everything. The room wasn't what she expected. The far wall was lined with shelves, each one crammed with meticulously labeled boxes. Some were marked with her name in Richard's unmistakable handwriting: Eleanor, Winter 1983, Eleanor, Paris Letters, Eleanor, Teaching Days. She felt a jolt in her chest. Why would Richard have stored boxes with her name, her history, here in a place he'd always kept locked and off-limits? To her left stood an antique car, a deep forest green Buick Skylark, perfectly restored. It gleamed beneath a canvas cover she had partially removed in the early dawn light. She recognized the car immediately. It was the same model Richard used to drive when they first met in the 70s, long before the suits and the business and the life of formality they had grown into. She walked slowly around it, hand trailing lightly across the hood. The paint was flawless. The tires were new. It was as if time had been reversed and this moment was suspended between then and now. But it was what she saw behind the car that made her stop cold. The entire back wall of the garage was transformed into a mosaic of memories, notes, blueprints, and photographs, some yellowed with age, others recent. Dozens of them were pinned in neat rows, intersected with string and annotations in Richard's handwriting. Names. Places. Quotes. Newspaper clippings. Even drawings. There were several photos of her, candid ones. Teaching in a classroom. Laughing in a garden. Sitting alone on a park bench, reading. She had never seen any of them before. It was like discovering someone had been documenting her life in silence. Watching. Remembering. But what truly froze her in place, what made her body lock with an almost physical paralysis, was the large whiteboard in the center of the wall. At the top, in block letters, were the words, "The Real Inheritance." Below it, an entire section was devoted to diagrams and plans. One sketch looked like a community center. Another featured outlines of training modules and schedules. And then, directly beneath a pinned photograph of her standing with a group of elderly students at a community college, was a phrase Richard had underlined 3 times. She was always the heart. The mind. The one who knew how to rebuild people. Eleanor's knees buckled, and she had to grab the workbench to steady herself. Her breath caught in her throat, and tears blurred her vision. This wasn't just some old storage room. This was a private archive. A shrine. A hidden record of a man who had understood her in ways he never said aloud while alive. "Richard," she whispered, the word trembling on her lips. She turned away for a moment, trying to collect herself, but the questions kept coming. Why hide this? Why lock it all away? Why give it to her only after he was gone? Her eyes moved back to the boxes. She knelt and opened one labeled Eleanor, Winter 1983. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to her. Each sealed with a wax stamp she vaguely remembered from Richard's study in their early years. She pulled one out and opened it. "My dearest Ellie. Today, you stood at the window for almost an hour, watching the snow fall. You didn't know I was watching you. But something about the way you looked out, like you were speaking to someone beyond the sky, it stopped me cold. I don't say enough that you are my center. My compass. My only true north." She stopped reading. Folded the letter. Put it back. More than 4 decades of letters, all written, never sent. She sat on the stool again, trying to process what she was seeing, what it all meant. She wanted to be angry. At the secrets. At the time lost. At the silence Richard had kept. But what she felt, more than anything, was overwhelmed. And then she noticed the safe. It was tucked into the corner, hidden behind a tall filing cabinet. The kind of safe used in banks or antique offices, heavy and dark and uninviting. It was bolted to the concrete floor, its combination dial rusted slightly but still functional. She approached it slowly, the gravity of it pulling at her curiosity like a magnet. Whatever was inside, Richard had not wanted just anyone to find it. There was no note. No instructions. Just the silence of the room and the hum of the wind pressing against the garage's thin walls. She tried a few numbers, her birthday, their anniversary, the year they got married. Nothing worked. She felt foolish, like she was grasping in the dark for a light switch that didn't exist. She stood again, walked back to the photographs on the wall, and stared at them. Somewhere in here, Richard had left a message. A breadcrumb. A path to follow. And not just in this garage. She knew, without doubt now, that Richard had been planning something far beyond a traditional inheritance. Something buried in these files, these letters, this car, this whiteboard, was a purpose. A mission. She looked back at the whiteboard, at the sketch of the building, what looked like a training facility, labeled Pilot Campus, Phase 1. Eleanor realized she wasn't just standing in a garage. She was standing in the middle of a secret blueprint for something that Richard had wanted her to finish. And for the first time since his death, she felt more than sorrow. She felt needed. Even in his absence, Richard was still speaking to her. She just had to keep listening. The second night Eleanor spent in the garage was not one of sleep, but of quiet unraveling. She had placed a chair near the workbench and wrapped herself in a heavy coat, a thermos of coffee beside her, and the box of letters on her lap. The safe stood nearby, silent and immovable, a constant reminder that the story unfolding around her was still incomplete. She read through 5 letters before midnight. Each one was dated, each one written in Richard's precise, deliberate hand. And each revealed more about the man she had loved, and the man she had not fully known. One letter, dated April of 1991, recounted the day she lost a teaching position after a change in district leadership. Richard wrote not only about his anger at the injustice, but also how deeply he admired the grace with which she handled the dismissal. He had even quoted one of her own lectures back to her: "The world may close doors, but it is up to us to build the windows." Eleanor folded the letter slowly, her fingers lingering on the page. She had no memory of Richard ever mentioning that phrase again after the day she'd said it aloud in frustration. Yet here it was, preserved, sacred, in his private correspondence. It was like discovering she had been seen, truly seen, all along. She returned the letters to the box and turned her attention back to the safe. It wasn't just the weight of the thing, its cold, iron presence, it was the question it posed. What had Richard deemed important enough to hide, even from her, all these years? The garage, though still unfamiliar, had begun to feel less like exile and more like a sacred space. She moved to the opposite wall where more boxes were stacked, looking for anything that might contain a clue. She pulled out one labeled "Photographs, 1970s," and flipped it open. Inside, bundled in neat stacks, were hundreds of prints. She shuffled through them slowly. There were photos of Richard's early business ventures, moments from their wedding she hadn't seen in years, and shots of Brandon as a toddler. But one photo made her stop entirely. It was a picture of her standing in front of a small cottage with a white picket fence. The date on the back read, July 12, 1980, and beneath it, written in Richard's handwriting, the day she said yes to staying, for all of it. The number 12,780 caught her attention. Could it be? She set the photo down and walked to the safe, knees aching from the cold floor. She turned the dial carefully. 1, 2, 7, 8, 0. Nothing. She tried reversing the order. Still nothing. Eleanor exhaled, rubbing her forehead. She was missing something, perhaps not just the numbers, but the meaning behind them. Morning came slowly, gray and wet. Rain tapped against the garage's roof as she moved through the boxes again. This time, she opened one labeled, Community Projects, Drafts. Inside were binders, presentation boards, and detailed outlines for something called Renew. The full name was handwritten beneath the acronym, reinforcing elderly needs through empowerment and work. It was Richard's voice she heard in her mind as she read the mission statement aloud: to offer opportunity, purpose, and income to those overlooked by society, to remind them that age is not irrelevance, but experience. She sat down heavily. The entire plan was here. Structured programs for job training, schedules for community outreach, lists of potential partnerships, and her name was on the cover of every document. Director, Eleanor Whitman. Not honorary. Not symbolic. Official. And then she saw it. Paperclipped to one of the binders was a faded envelope marked, Private, use only if ready. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper. No salutation. Just a short message. Ellie, if you found this, then you know there's more. You always knew how to lead, I just had to build the room big enough for you to take the stage. The safe holds the full blueprint, the startup funds, and the final legal files. The combination is the one date I never forgot, because it changed everything. Not our wedding. Not Brandon's birth. But the night you told me about your dream, the night you said you wanted to help those nobody saw. Look at the file marked, First Drafts. You'll know. She dropped the note and opened a nearby file folder labeled, First Drafts. Tucked in the back was an old notebook, her handwriting unmistakable, from more than 30 years ago. On the inside cover, she'd scribbled the words, March 22, 1992, I told him. He listened. She stared at the numbers. March 22, 1992. That had to be it. She walked to the safe again, slowly, carefully. She entered the numbers, 3, 2, 2, 9, 2. A soft click. The handle turned. And the door creaked open. Inside, neatly stacked, were 4 thick binders, a small wooden box, and a sealed envelope with her name written in bold strokes across the front. She opened the envelope first. "Ellie. If you're reading this, then I am gone. And I regret only that I could not see your face when you realized what was always yours. This was never about the house. Or money. Or even legacy. This was about you, about giving you the room to become what the world never allowed you to be while I was here. I always knew you were meant to lead something. I built the structure. You are the soul. The bank account in your name, ending in 4928, holds the startup funds. The project is legally registered. Everything is yours. I couldn't protect you from Brandon's bitterness. But I could protect this dream. And you, Ellie, you are more than anyone has ever given you credit for. Now show them. Richard." She closed her eyes, pressing the letter to her chest, the silence around her no longer hollow but full of meaning. Richard hadn't left her behind. He had set her free. Inside the wooden box were financial documents, account numbers, access credentials, proof of ownership. More than $200,000 had been allocated to launch the program. She looked around the garage again. It wasn't a garage. It was a command center. She stood slowly, heart steady, eyes sharp. This wasn't just about grief anymore. It was about building what she had always imagined, and proving, finally, that what Richard saw in her was real. Eleanor spent most of that night sorting through the contents of the safe, her hands methodical, her mind racing. Every page, every document she touched brought new clarity, and new weight. Richard had left nothing to chance. The program was ready to launch. All it needed was her. As dawn broke, soft rain still falling outside, Eleanor set the final binder back into the safe and turned her attention to a small envelope she had missed the night before. It had been tucked inside a legal folder marked, "Compliance, Phase 2. The envelope was sealed with red wax and had no name on the front, only the letter J. Inside, folded neatly, was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't in Richard's handwriting. The ink was darker, the strokes heavier, more angular. She read it aloud, slowly. "E. If you're reading this, then he trusted you as much as I hoped he would. But be careful. Not everything was shared with you. The project wasn't just about restoring dignity. It was also about correcting a mistake. Ask Jack Rosen. He knows what Richard was really afraid of." There was no signature. No date. Just that cryptic message. Eleanor stared at the note for a long time, the words settling in like a layer of dust over everything she thought she understood. Jack Rosen. The name tugged at something deep in her memory. Richard had mentioned him before, once or twice, back when they were younger. Business partner. Friend. A man she had only met once in passing at a fundraiser, decades ago. She folded the note and slipped it into her coat pocket. Later that morning, after washing up in the small half-bath behind the garage, the one Richard had secretly renovated years ago, she made herself a modest breakfast from the stash of canned food and granola bars stored in a plastic bin. She took her coffee in a thermos and walked out into the now clearing air. The sky had softened into a pale silver, clouds thinning overhead. She could hear birds again. Brandon's car was gone from the driveway. She didn't care where he had gone. Eleanor walked 4 blocks to the public library, a place she hadn't stepped into in years. The librarian, a young woman with bright eyes and tired shoulders, greeted her politely. Eleanor requested access to public records and began her search. She found Jack Rosen easily. He was listed as co-founder of Whitman and Rosen Consulting, a management firm that had boomed in the late 1990s and faded into near obscurity by 2010. Several articles detailed the rise and fall of the company, including a lawsuit in 2008, a silent settlement, and Jack's sudden retirement from public life. The last address listed was in the town of Beaverton, about 30 miles from her suburb. Eleanor copied the address by hand and left the library without hesitation. She took the bus into Beaverton and walked the last stretch on foot. The house was modest, a single-story cottage with ivy climbing up its brick facade. The front yard was well kept, and a wooden wind chime tinkled gently from the porch. She rang the bell twice and waited. After a moment, the door opened, revealing a man in his early 70s. He had a lean frame, white hair that still held a wave, and the wary eyes of someone who'd seen too much. "Yes? Jack Rosen?" she asked. His eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "My name is Eleanor Whitman. I'm Richard's wife." Jack blinked. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." Inside, the house smelled of coffee and cedarwood. Books lined the walls, and newspapers were stacked in neat piles. He led her to a sunlit sitting room and gestured toward an armchair. "I thought you might come," he said quietly. "Eventually." "You knew about the garage," she said. Jack sat across from her, rubbing his hands together slowly. "I helped him build it. Not physically, but the idea, the design. The secrecy. That was Richard's doing. I just provided counsel." "Then tell me what this means." Eleanor pulled the note from her coat and handed it to him. He read it without surprise. "I recognize the handwriting," he said. "It's Richard's brother. Jonathan. Jonathan died in the 80s. Jack shook his head. "That's what the family was told. But he didn't. He changed his name, moved south. Richard kept it secret from everyone, even you, apparently." Eleanor leaned back, stunned. Why would he lie about something like that? "Because Jonathan made a mistake," Jack said slowly. "A mistake that nearly destroyed the company. And Richard, he never recovered from it. The garage, the project, all of it was part penance, part redemption." "What kind of mistake?" Jack hesitated. Then he stood and walked to a small safe behind the bookshelf. He opened it and retrieved a worn leather folder. He handed it to her. "This was part of the original files Richard asked me to destroy. I never could." Inside were documents stamped confidential. One was a proposal from the year 1987, written by Jonathan Whitman, detailing a scheme involving pension redirection and offshore investments. At first glance, it looked legal. But Eleanor had worked with enough administrative reports in her life to know better. This is theft," she whispered. Jack nodded. "They covered it up. The money was returned. But not before it jeopardized hundreds of retirements. Richard took the blame publicly. He thought it would protect the company, and his brother." Eleanor closed the folder. Her heart was pounding. So the program, the Elderly Employment Initiative, was Richard's way of making it right, Jack finished. He didn't want people to suffer for something his family had done, something he had allowed, even if by silence. And the garage? The secrecy? He didn't want Brandon to ever touch it, Jack said bitterly. "Your son is a shark, Eleanor." Richard feared what he would do if he knew there was still value buried in those plans. Eleanor stood, her hands trembling. "He tried to fix it in the only way he knew." Jack nodded. She moved toward the door, her thoughts spinning. "There's one more thing," she said, turning back. "Why didn't you come forward when Richard died?" "Because the program wasn't ready," Jack replied. "And because it was never my legacy to protect." "It is now," she said. As she stepped out into the afternoon light, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about reclaiming her dignity, or honoring Richard's vision. It was about finishing what he couldn't. And confronting the shadows he left behind. The following morning was unusually still. A thin veil of fog had settled across the backyard, muting the edges of the world beyond the garage's narrow windows. Eleanor stood near the whiteboard wall, her fingers lightly grazing the edges of the pinned photos and notes. She had rearranged a few of Richard's plans the night before, adjusting the timeline for the pilot phase and highlighting the essential contacts Jack had helped her remember. The safe now sat open, not as a vault but as a wellspring. The documents inside were no longer just symbols of Richard's hidden life, they were now hers to act on. The startup funds had been confirmed. The program had legal viability. She had even made a short list of local contacts she could begin reaching out to, names Richard had scribbled beside phrases like potential coordinator or grant liaison. She was making progress, quietly and methodically, until the sound of tires screeching across the gravel driveway shattered the stillness. A car door slammed. Footsteps, heavy, rushed, crunched across the path. Then the sharp, unmistakable voice of Brandon cut through the quiet. "Open the damn door, Mother." Eleanor didn't move. Brandon pounded on the garage door, the kind of knocking meant to provoke, not to announce. "I know you're in there. You think you're clever, keeping all this hidden? I saw the bank alert. You accessed an account I didn't even know existed." Eleanor sighed and turned slowly. She walked to the door and opened it, not wide, just enough for her to see him and let him know she wasn't afraid. Brandon stood there in a blazer thrown over a wrinkled t-shirt, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched tight. He looked like he hadn't slept. "Get in the house," he said. "I'm not leaving," Eleanor replied calmly. His eyes darted past her shoulder. "What the hell is all that?" "You don't get to know," she said. "Not anymore." He pushed the door open and stepped inside before she could stop him. His eyes scanned the space, the whiteboard, the binders, the old car, the safe. His face twisted as he registered the order, the intention, the significance of what she had uncovered. "This is what he gave you?" he asked. "This mess?" She didn't answer. He moved toward the safe and picked up one of the binders. "You're playing with things you don't understand. This could damage the company." "There is no company," she said. "You dismantled it. I sold off what needed to be sold. You think Dad was some kind of saint? He was weak. Soft. Always dragging his feet instead of maximizing what we had. He was trying to repair what your uncle destroyed," she said, her voice low but firm. Brandon froze. She saw it, the flicker of recognition. He knew about Jonathan. Maybe not all of it, but enough to understand that her words weren't a guess. "You've been digging," he said. "I've been reading what your father left behind." Brandon slammed the binder shut. "He left it behind because he couldn't finish it. And now you think you can?" She met his gaze. "Yes. You're old," he said, almost spitting the word. "No one's going to listen to you. You don't even know how any of this works. I know what integrity looks like. I know what community means. And I know how to build something that lasts." He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "You really think this little charity project means anything? Do you know how much money is tied to this land alone? You're sitting on a gold mine, and you're scribbling on whiteboards like a high school teacher." "I was a teacher," she said. "Exactly," he sneered. "That's all you ever were. All you'll ever be." She didn't flinch. "And you're still the boy who stomped his feet when things didn't go his way. But this isn't yours, Brandon. Not the garage. Not the project. Not the vision." He pointed a finger at her. "You think I'll just let this go? I can contest the will. I can have you declared unfit. I've already spoken to a lawyer." "Then do it," she said, stepping toward him. "Try. Take it to court. Let them see what your father left. Let them read the documents. Watch how the judge reacts when they learn you pressured him to sell off his shares weeks before he died." He went pale. She saw it. The fear. The guilt. "I found the emails," she said. "Richard kept everything." He turned away, face burning with rage and shame. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" He grabbed a stack of papers from the workbench and threw them across the floor. "This is garbage," he yelled. "You're going to waste everything he built." "No," she said softly. "I'm going to finish what he started." He stood there, chest heaving, surrounded by the mess he'd made. Papers scattered across the concrete. A photo fluttered at his feet, one of Eleanor, laughing in the sun, clipped to the board Richard had built. He stared at it. And for a moment, something broke. Not loudly. Not visibly. Just a small fracture in the arrogance that held him up. He turned and walked out without another word. The garage door slammed behind him. Eleanor bent slowly, picked up the photo, and returned it to its place. Then she gathered the papers, one by one, returning order to the chaos he had tried to create. Her hands shook slightly, but her resolve was unshaken. He could threaten. He could yell. He could drag her name through court. But he would never own this. Not the garage. Not the truth. And certainly not her. The week that followed Brandon's intrusion passed in measured silence, but Eleanor was not idle. Her days began early, always before the sun rose. She brewed coffee in the small kitchenette Richard had secretly added to the back of the garage and sat with the growing stack of papers and binders, charting out each piece of the Renew initiative. She transformed the cluttered space into an organized command post. The whiteboard evolved daily, lines shifted, connections were drawn, names were moved to priority lists. But even with Richard's meticulous planning, Eleanor knew the project would not survive on vision alone. She needed hands. She needed voices. She needed people, real people, who could bring what had started in secrecy into the public eye. And she knew exactly who to start with. On a cold Wednesday morning, Eleanor stood in front of the glass doors of the Portland Community Resource Center. She had once volunteered here, years ago, teaching night classes to senior citizens eager to learn computer literacy and basic job skills. The director back then had been Margaret Dillon, a firm but fair woman whose presence commanded respect. Eleanor didn't know if Margaret was still there, but she stepped inside with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The receptionist at the front desk was a young man, barely 20, tapping away at a keyboard. "Good morning," Eleanor said. "Is Margaret Dillon still the director here?" He looked up and offered a quick smile. "She retired last year. But her replacement is in today. Do you want to leave your name?" "I'd rather speak with her in person," Eleanor replied. "It's urgent." He hesitated, then picked up the phone. "I'll check." Minutes later, Eleanor was ushered into a modest office near the back. A woman in her mid-30s stood to greet her. She wore a burgundy cardigan and thick-rimmed glasses. Her nameplate read, "Rachel Connors, Executive Director." "Mrs. Whitman?" Rachel extended her hand. "I'm Rachel. Margaret spoke highly of you. She mentioned the digital literacy workshops you ran back in the day." "That feels like another lifetime," Eleanor said with a small smile. "But I'm here because I believe something important is about to begin. And I think your center should be part of it." Rachel gestured for her to sit. "Tell me everything." Eleanor pulled a folder from her bag and laid it on the desk. Inside were copies of Richard's plans for Renew, a summary of its purpose, and a list of proposed partnerships. Rachel read silently for several minutes, her brow furrowing, her fingers tapping the edge of the folder. This is ambitious," she said finally. "You're talking about a full-scale workforce reintegration program for seniors, funded independently?" Eleanor nodded. "It's already funded. The foundation exists. My husband built it quietly over the last 15 years. He left it to me to carry forward." "And the facility?" "I'm converting a private structure on my property into a pilot center," Eleanor said. "It's fully equipped, structurally sound, and zoned for multi-use. What I need are people, advisors, trainers, counselors." Rachel looked up. "You want our help?" "I want your partnership." There was a pause. Then Rachel leaned back in her chair and smiled. "We've had seniors asking for something like this for years. Something that doesn't just give them a stipend, but a reason to get up in the morning. Work, purpose, community. I'll need to talk to our board, but personally, I think it's a beautiful idea." Eleanor felt a tightness in her chest begin to loosen. Then let's talk next steps. Over the next 2 hours, they built out a rough action plan. Rachel suggested a few retired instructors who might be willing to consult. Eleanor offered to host an information session at the garage within the next 2 weeks. Before she left, Rachel handed her a stack of business cards. "These are some of the people you'll want to reach," she said. Community liaisons, a journalist at the Portland Voice, and a grant writer who's done miracles for grassroots projects. Eleanor tucked the cards into her purse. "Thank you, Rachel." "Thank you for not giving up," Rachel replied. That night, back in the garage, Eleanor sat in front of her growing wall of charts and contacts. She added Rachel's name. Then she added 2 more she'd already called, retired HR specialists who remembered her from years past and offered to consult. She worked well into the night. At one point, she paused to make tea and opened the window slightly to let in the cool air. Outside, the distant sound of children playing in the street reminded her that the world, no matter how heavy it felt, was still moving. And she was moving with it. 2 days later, Eleanor met with the journalist Rachel had recommended. His name was Colin Leary, and he looked far too young to be taken seriously, but he arrived early, asked sharp questions, and listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished explaining the project's origin and its goals, Colin looked down at his notes. "And your son?" he asked, almost gently. "Will he try to block this?" "He's already tried," she said. "He believes the garage is worthless. He doesn't understand what value looks like." Colin gave her a small, respectful nod. "I'd like to write about this. But it won't be just a profile. I'll want to talk to people, get quotes, speak to those you're planning to help." "Do it," she said. "Tell the truth." That Sunday, Eleanor stood at the front of the garage, now organized, clean, and partially renovated, and welcomed 15 people inside. They came from all directions: a retired nurse, a widowed accountant, a man who once managed a hardware store and now lived on Social Security. Eleanor served coffee and introduced herself. She explained what Renew was, what it could become, what they could help her build. By the end of the morning, 10 of them had signed interest forms. It was real now. Later, after the last of them had left and the sun had begun to set, Eleanor sat in the wooden chair Richard used to keep in the corner. She looked around and felt the space breathe. It had been a tomb once, filled with hidden memories and quiet regrets. Now it was something else entirely. A beginning. The Monday following the community meeting brought a sudden change in weather. The clouds that had been drifting lazily over Oregon skies turned heavy, and by mid-morning, a steady rain drummed against the roof of the garage. Inside, Eleanor sat hunched over the long folding table she had converted into her project desk, surrounded by piles of intake forms, volunteer lists, and architectural drafts. Despite the cold seeping in through the concrete floor, she was warm with purpose. The garage had transformed into something alive. But one detail kept pulling at her focus: the locked filing cabinet beside the safe. It was smaller than the safe, a black 2-drawer unit tucked under the workbench, with no label, no markings. The key was missing, and Richard had left no mention of it in any of his notes. Eleanor had tried the spare keys she found in the kitchen drawer of the main house before Brandon had changed the locks, but none fit. She hadn't given it much thought until Colin, the young journalist, returned that morning to photograph the space for his article. "What's in here?" he had asked, tapping the top of the cabinet with the back of his knuckle. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "It's locked." "It could be nothing," he said. "Or it could be the good stuff." After he left, she couldn't shake the thought. She tried a few more combinations on the old rotary dial lock, birthdates, anniversaries, even Richard's business license number, but nothing worked. The dial stuck stubbornly in place each time. She considered hiring a locksmith, but something inside her resisted the idea of inviting anyone else in, not yet. This was still hers to uncover. That evening, while reviewing the original schematic drawings for the Renew facility, Eleanor noticed a small sketch on the back of one of Richard's old diagrams. It looked like a room, her classroom from the late 1980s. The same one she had taught in for nearly 12 years before budget cuts closed the adult education program. At the bottom of the page, Richard had scribbled a note in faint pencil, where it all began. Always start from the beginning. She turned the paper over and looked again at the blueprint of the facility's main hall. The inspiration was unmistakable. The layout mirrored her old classroom, one large table at the center, bulletin boards along the back, storage cabinets near the door. Even the corner bookshelf was marked. Richard hadn't just modeled the center after a learning space, he'd modeled it after her space. The room where she'd first spoken aloud about her dream to create something better for people like her students, people left behind by the job market. And then she remembered something. Inside her old school bag, buried in a storage box in the corner of the garage, there had once been a copy of her original lesson plan from 1992, the year she'd shared that dream with Richard over tea after class. She had handwritten it in ink and folded it inside a folder marked Special Projects. She hadn't seen it in decades. She stood quickly and moved to the boxes Richard had labeled by year. She sorted through the contents until she found one marked E, Teaching Materials. Inside, sealed in a plastic envelope, was the folder she had nearly forgotten. She pulled it out with trembling fingers. And there it was, the plan, still intact. But it wasn't just the plan. Tucked inside the folded paper was a Polaroid photo of her classroom's chalkboard from that year. Written across it in big, white letters, success is 52,318 parts vision, 47,682 parts effort. It was a quote she used often, a nonsense number meant to make her students smile, to remind them that success wasn't measured by conventional tools. She had said it over and over. Richard had laughed at it once, called it the world's most impractical equation. But he had written it down. Preserved it. She looked at the filing cabinet again. Her hands moved before doubt could stop them. She turned the dial. 5, 2, 3, 1, 8. Click. The latch gave. Her breath caught. She pulled the drawer open. Inside was a row of meticulously labeled manila folders, each marked with bold handwriting: Legacy Assets, Alternate Drafts, Whitman vs. Rosen Settlement, Confidential, and one marked simply, Ellie, Private. She pulled the last one first. Inside were photographs, all taken without her knowledge. She was in her classroom, in front of the chalkboard, helping an elderly student with a resume, sharing a cup of coffee with another after hours. She flipped through them slowly, heart aching. On the last page was a note, hastily scribbled. Ellie. If the safe held the future, this drawer holds the past. I wasn't brave enough to tell you everything, but I kept it here, every step of the journey. Every misstep. Every apology I was too proud to make. You always said that memory was a teacher's greatest tool. So here it is, all the lessons I never said out loud. She set the folder down and pulled another, Legacy Assets. Inside were title deeds to property she hadn't known they still owned, old investment certificates, and an uncashed check written to Jonathan Whitman, dated 4 years before his supposed death. The past was unraveling in layers now. She grabbed the next file, Whitman vs. Rosen, and found a legal brief, complete with depositions and a confidential settlement agreement. Eleanor sat down slowly, eyes widening. The dispute hadn't been about mismanagement. It had been about exposure. Richard had planned to come forward about Jonathan's financial crimes years earlier, but Jack had begged him to delay it until they could shield the employees from fallout. The settlement had required silence. Legal silence. But what struck her most wasn't the content. It was the date on the document, March 22, 1992. The day she had told Richard her dream. It was the day he had chosen not just to listen, but to change. He had given up the fight in court, taken the fall for his brother, and turned his focus inward, to her idea, her vision. And now the responsibility of finishing it lay entirely with her. She closed the drawers gently and stood, staring at the open cabinet, the faint scent of old paper mixing with the musty smell of rain-soaked wood. It was no longer about simply building a center or protecting Richard's name. It was about making sense of everything he had done, what he had sacrificed, what he had built in silence. She returned the folders to the drawer and locked it again, this time noting the combination on a page in her notebook. Not because she needed it for herself anymore, but because someone, someday, might. A knock on the garage door startled her. She opened it to find Rachel Connor standing outside, umbrella in hand. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," Rachel said, "but I thought you should see this." She handed Eleanor a folded copy of the Portland Voice. The headline read, "Widow of Late Executive Launches Revolutionary Program for Seniors," from an old garage. Below it, Collins' article. Photos. Quotes. The story was out. Eleanor smiled faintly, rain streaking the edges of her coat. "Come in," she said. "There's more I need to show you." The article in the Portland Voice sparked more than conversation. It sparked momentum. Within 48 hours, Eleanor's phone rang nearly non-stop. Former colleagues she hadn't spoken to in years, retired professionals who had read the piece and wanted to contribute, even strangers from other counties asking how they could replicate the model in their own communities. What began as a quiet, almost invisible movement inside an old garage was now igniting conversations across the state. But Eleanor knew that attention was not enough. Good intentions alone wouldn't protect the program from scrutiny, bureaucracy, or Brandon's increasingly aggressive legal threats. A cease and desist letter arrived 2 days after the article's publication, thinly veiled intimidation from Brandon's legal team, claiming unauthorized use of Whitman family resources and unauthorized operation of a facility on residential property. She tossed it into the drawer with the others. That night, with the garage lit only by the warm glow of a desk lamp and the hum of an old space heater, Eleanor returned to the open safe. Though she had already retrieved the legal files, the project binders, and the financial records, there remained a single large folder she hadn't dared open, one marked "Renew, Final Design, Not to be Shared." Richard's handwriting was unmistakable. There was something heavier about it, as if the very weight of the truth was embedded in the ink. She sat down, opened the folder, and began to read. At first, it appeared to be an expansion plan, maps, budgets, staffing models, but as she moved through the pages, a deeper intention emerged. The program wasn't just meant to support seniors re-entering the workforce. It was a self-sustaining model that combined microgrants, cooperative business ownership, and skill exchange. In Richard's words, it was a new economy in miniature, built from those the larger system had discarded. One page stood out. A schematic of a satellite location, drawn in precise architectural lines, labeled Phase 3, the network begins. In the margins, Richard had written, "We don't need permission to change the world. We just need proof it can be done once." She turned the page. Behind it, tucked carefully into a plastic sleeve, was a list titled The First Cohort. Names, ages, brief notes next to each: an auto mechanic with arthritis who had been denied disability, a retired librarian who had lost her pension in a city bankruptcy, a former seamstress now living in a senior housing complex. Many were people Eleanor remembered from old community events, forgotten names returning like whispers in the dark. At the bottom of the list, Richard had added a single line. "These are the lives we save before they disappear." She placed the binder down with reverence, her fingers lingering on the edge. This wasn't charity. It was preservation. The next day, she called Rachel Connors and asked her to come to the garage again. When Rachel arrived, Eleanor greeted her not with small talk but with a stack of folders. "I want to show you the actual scale of what Richard built," she said. "Not just the pilot center. Everything." They sat for over 3 hours as Eleanor explained every piece: the financial loop that allowed participants to earn without jeopardizing their benefits, the mentorship roles built into the structure so no participant was only a recipient but also a contributor, and the long-term plan to make each center autonomous, able to operate without constant outside funding. Rachel listened intently, flipping through the diagrams and tables. This could change the landscape," she said, almost breathless. "This isn't just support, it's redesign." Eleanor nodded. "I want to build the first full-scale location here." Not just the garage, but the adjacent land. Richard had it rezoned years ago under a different name. He was planning this long before I knew. Rachel looked at her. Are you ready for what this means? It won't be quiet. The moment this becomes public knowledge, you'll have pushback, from the city, from the state, from Brandon. I'm ready, Eleanor said. And I'm not doing it alone. By the end of the week, they had assembled a core team: Rachel, 2 retired grant coordinators, a former urban planner, and a logistics consultant who had worked in veteran outreach. Each brought something vital to the table. And yet, even as the project gained legitimacy, a shadow hovered over Eleanor. The safe may have revealed the program's core, but the open wound between her and Brandon remained unresolved. His threats grew more frequent. He showed up twice, unannounced, standing outside the garage, arms crossed, saying nothing, just watching. The last time, he left a letter wedged in the side gate, a formal notice of intent to contest the will in court. Eleanor kept it. She knew confrontation was inevitable, but she wouldn't let it derail her. Instead, she turned to something Richard had hinted at in his final letter: the fact that the program had been legally registered, and she was the sole legal executor of its operations. She needed confirmation. Rachel helped her schedule an appointment with a trusted estate lawyer, Charles Meacham, a seasoned attorney known for handling complex trusts and philanthropic estates. His office was tucked inside a converted Victorian house in downtown Portland. Eleanor brought every document, every binder, and Richard's original will. Charles read silently for nearly an hour, stopping only once to request tea. When he finally looked up, his expression was not skeptical, it was impressed. Mrs. Whitman, he said, removing his glasses. Your husband was very thorough. This is not just a protected program. It's a registered nonprofit foundation with autonomous authority. According to the trust, all project operations and associated properties were transferred to your name 2 months before his death. Your son has no legal claim to the initiative. Eleanor exhaled. Even if he contests the will? He can contest the house, the assets, anything tied to the estate itself. But this, he held up the program's charter, this is outside of that. It's watertight. She nodded. Thank you. When she left the office, the clouds had parted. The city felt new again. She walked 3 blocks to a small cafe, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window. She watched the people outside, young, old, tired, joyful, hurried, aimless. She wondered how many of them carried hidden dreams, how many had been told they were too late, too old, too slow to matter. And then she remembered the line Richard had written beside her photo on the garage wall. She was always the heart. The mind. The one who knew how to rebuild people. She smiled to herself. Because now, the rebuilding had truly begun. The letter from Brandon's attorney arrived the following Tuesday, hand-delivered by a process server who looked genuinely apologetic when Eleanor opened the garage door. It wasn't just a notice of intent anymore, it was the formal filing of a civil petition to contest the will. In clear, assertive language, Brandon claimed that his father had not been of sound mind when he amended the estate, and that Eleanor had unduly influenced him during his final months. He sought the immediate suspension of her authority over all Whitman-related assets, including the structure known as the garage. She read it in silence, her fingers steady despite the shaking in her chest. She placed the document in the drawer beside the others and sat at the workbench. It wasn't the accusation that hurt, it was the cold, impersonal tone. The boy she had raised had now turned her into a legal adversary. Rachel arrived just an hour later, summoned by a short text. She took one look at Eleanor's face and said nothing, only waited for the explanation. He filed, Eleanor said, handing her the document. Rachel read through it quickly, her lips tightening. We knew this might happen. I didn't expect him to accuse me of manipulation, Eleanor said, softer now. You're a threat, Rachel replied. Not just to his inheritance, but to the version of the past he's trying to protect. This project undermines everything he wants the world to believe about his father. And me, Eleanor added. Rachel didn't argue. Instead, She pulled out her phone. "We need legal representation immediately. Not just a consultant, we need someone who can defend this in court." That evening, after several calls and recommendations, Eleanor met with Annette Keller, a respected elder law attorney known for her work defending guardianship rights and estate integrity in contentious cases. Annette was direct, sharply intelligent, and not easily impressed, but by the end of their first meeting, she leaned forward and said, "You're doing more than defending a will, Mrs. Whitman. You're defending legacy, and you're going to win." Annette filed a formal response within 48 hours, requesting that the court recognize the Renew Initiative as a separate, legally protected entity established outside the bounds of the disputed estate. She also submitted documentation from Charles Meacham confirming the independent trust Richard had created for the program and the clear transfer of authority to Eleanor. But the court hearing was granted, an expedited date due to the asset claims, and Eleanor found herself sitting in the county courthouse just over a week later, flanked by Annette and Rachel. Brandon arrived with 2 attorneys in suits that cost more than her car. He wore the expression of a man who believed the outcome was already certain, his smile smug as he passed her in the hallway. Eleanor didn't return the gesture. She studied him instead, wondering if anything remained of the boy who used to fall asleep beside her on long car rides, clutching a toy dinosaur. Inside the courtroom, the judge, a composed, silver-haired woman named Marianne Trent, reviewed the initial statements with quiet intensity. Annette spoke first, presenting the trust documents, the nonprofit registration, and Richard's original signed letters. She emphasized the years of planning, the timeline of development, and Eleanor's role not just as widow, but as executor and partner in the project's creation. Brandon's attorney countered with claims of coercion, citing Richard's declining health and sudden, last-minute decisions made without transparency. They introduced testimony from a financial advisor who claimed Richard's cognition had appeared scattered in their final meeting. But Eleanor had anticipated this. When Annette rose again, she called Jack Rosen to the stand. Jack walked slowly but steadily to the front, wearing a dark blazer and holding a manila folder. He identified himself, his role in the former Whitman and Rosen firm, and his ongoing relationship with Richard. "Were you aware of the Renew project?" Annette asked. "Yes. I helped draft the early legal language for the pilot structure. Richard wanted everything airtight. He was planning for the long term." "Did he appear confused or compromised during those conversations?" Jack gave a soft snort. "No. If anything, he was more focused than I'd seen him in years. This project gave him purpose." "And was Eleanor involved?" "From the beginning, though she didn't know how deep it ran. Richard kept most of it quiet, but he always said he was building it for her." Annette paused. "Mr. Rosen, do you have anything you'd like to submit to the court?" Jack nodded. "I do." He handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "These are emails, handwritten notes, and voice memos Richard left with me in case something ever happened to him. He feared his son might challenge the will." The courtroom went still. The judge reviewed the documents, then looked up. "We'll reconvene in 2 days. I want time to review the supplemental materials before issuing a ruling." Outside the courthouse, Brandon confronted Eleanor in the parking lot. "You dragged my name through the mud," he hissed. "You did that to yourself," she replied calmly. "She was mine too. That house, my legacy. You think building your little charity makes you a saint?" "No," she said. "But it makes me someone who listens. Something you never learned to do." He stared at her, eyes narrowed. Then he walked away without another word. The night before the final hearing, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She paced the garage, touching the edges of the whiteboard, rereading the program outlines, glancing at the pictures of the seniors who had already come through the doors. This wasn't theoretical anymore. Lives had begun to shift because of what Richard left behind. The following morning, Judge Trent delivered her ruling in a packed courtroom. After reviewing the documentation, the timeline of the project, and the legal foundation of the Renew Initiative, this court finds no evidence of undue influence, nor any legal basis to suspend the authority of Eleanor Whitman as executor of the Associated Trust. The program in question is recognized as an independent legal entity. The will shall remain as written." She paused, looking toward Brandon. "As for the claim of cognitive impairment, the court finds insufficient evidence to support that accusation. The petition is denied." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, a quiet breath of release. Brandon stood, face unreadable, and left the courtroom without a word. Outside, reporters waited, but Eleanor kept her answers brief. "The work will continue," she said. "That's all that matters." That evening, the garage was filled with laughter and voices once again. Volunteers, former students, partners from the resource center, all gathered to celebrate the victory. They brought food, music, flowers. Someone played an old piano tune on a portable keyboard. Rachel gave a short speech. Then someone handed Eleanor a microphone. She hesitated, then spoke. "This wasn't just a legal win," she said. "It was a test of whether purpose still has a place in a world that so often forgets us. And today, we answered yes." The applause was soft but real. And when it faded, she sat beside the old Buick Skylark, watching the people Richard had hoped to serve begin to take their first real steps forward. 3 days after the court ruling, the atmosphere in the garage had begun to settle into something that felt remarkably like rhythm. People came and went throughout the day, volunteers, seniors participating in the first round of workshops, and city representatives who had heard about Renew through the growing media buzz. The sense of movement was constant, but controlled. Eleanor managed it all from her makeshift desk beside the old car, using a whiteboard, color-coded spreadsheets, and what she referred to only half-jokingly as her war binder. Yet even in the midst of this progress, a lingering unease clung to the air. Brandon had gone silent since losing in court, but silence from him never meant retreat, it meant recalibration. Eleanor had lived long enough to recognize that kind of quiet. The absence of conflict didn't mean resolution. It meant a storm was being prepared elsewhere. It was during a late afternoon planning session with Rachel and Colin that the unexpected witness first made contact. Eleanor's phone buzzed, a local number she didn't recognize. She excused herself from the table and answered. "Mrs. Whitman?" a woman's voice asked, cautious, almost trembling. "Yes, speaking. My name is Teresa Blanchard. I used to work for your husband. For Richard. In the accounting department, back when the firm was still operating." Eleanor stiffened. "I remember the name. I saw the article in the Portland Voice," Teresa said. "And the follow-up? And the court case? I didn't want to get involved before, but there's something you need to see. Something Richard gave me, years ago. In case Brandon ever tried to do what he's doing now." Eleanor stepped away from the garage entrance, her voice dropping. "Are you willing to meet in person?" "Yes. Please. I've held this long enough." They arranged to meet the following morning at a small diner on the edge of town, a place where Eleanor had once taken Brandon for pancakes after Sunday school. Teresa arrived precisely on time. She was in her late 50s now, dressed modestly in a navy blazer and slacks, her eyes alert but heavy. She carried a plain manila envelope in her hand, clutched tightly like a relic. "Thank you for meeting me," Teresa said as they sat in a booth by the window. "I appreciate your courage," Eleanor replied. "You could have stayed quiet." "I did. For too long." Teresa slid the envelope across the table. "I was Richard's assistant for nearly 8 years. Not officially, that's what the public saw. But I was also his auditor. He trusted me to verify every major transaction. That's how I found the transfers Brandon made, unauthorized withdrawals from the company's primary account. Small at first, then larger. Richard confronted him, and they fought. But Brandon threatened to go public with personal allegations if Richard pushed it further." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I didn't know it got that far." "He gave me this," Teresa said, nodding toward the envelope. "He told me to hold it. To deliver it only if Brandon ever tried to take the project from you." Eleanor opened the envelope slowly. Inside were printed bank statements, annotated with Richard's notes, and a USB drive. A yellow post-it was stuck to it with a single line in his handwriting: "They always hide the truth in the silence." "I haven't opened the drive," Teresa said. "I don't want anything to do with it after today." "You've done more than enough," Eleanor said. "This will help." Teresa stood. "For what it's worth. I think he always knew you'd be the one to finish what he started. Not Brandon. Not anyone else." Back in the garage, Eleanor inserted the USB into her laptop. What opened wasn't just a spreadsheet, it was a confession. Richard had recorded a video, dated 2 months before his death. He sat at the workbench in the garage, wearing his favorite brown sweater, hands folded. His voice was steady, but his face betrayed the exhaustion he had carried for years. "If you're watching this, Eleanor, then you're standing in the place where everything began. And everything must be finished." He paused. "I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong people. I let my guilt silence me for too long. Brandon, he took money from the company. Not for need, but for pride. To cover debt he wouldn't admit. I confronted him. I begged him to stop. But he said things, cruel things. Things about you. About the program." Richard looked down for a moment, then back at the camera. "I wanted to protect him. Even then. I thought maybe losing the house would teach him something. I was wrong." He reached beside him and held up a stack of papers. "These are records of every unauthorized transaction. I kept copies off-site, in Teresa's care, so no one could destroy them." His eyes softened. "Ellie, this isn't just about money or land. It's about proving that we, people like us, still matter. That wisdom and purpose don't expire with age. That dignity is a right, not a reward." The video ended there. Eleanor stared at the screen for a long moment before copying the files onto a backup drive and locking the original in the safe. The next day, Annette filed a motion to bar any further claims from Brandon against the trust, citing newly discovered financial misconduct, with evidence to suggest that Richard had removed Brandon from any decision-making roles as a direct consequence of those actions. When Brandon was served with the motion, he appeared unannounced at the garage for the last time. Eleanor stood firm, not calling for help, not flinching. "You think this is over?" he said. "It's already over," she replied. "And you ended it." He stepped closer. "You ruined everything." "No. You did that the moment you thought money was more important than your father's memory." Brandon turned away, fists clenched, and disappeared down the street. He didn't return again. The court granted the motion within the week, citing clear evidence of fraud and intent to obstruct Richard's final wishes. All claims were permanently barred. Eleanor was now, in every legal sense, untouchable. Rachel, upon hearing the news, simply said, "Now we build." And they did. With the legal storm behind them and Richard's full design now public, donations began to pour in. Retired professionals volunteered in droves. Eleanor expanded her vision, converting the garage into a fully functioning satellite office for Renew's broader regional hub. Other neighborhoods requested guidance on starting their own. But she never forgot Teresa. One afternoon, she mailed a handwritten letter to the small address on Teresa's resume, thanking her not just for the files, but for carrying Richard's truth all those years. Because in the end, it wasn't just the law or the strategy or the will that saved the project. It was someone brave enough to speak, after years of silence. By mid-autumn, the garage no longer looked like a garage at all. The oil-stained floor had been cleaned and resurfaced, the cracked windows replaced with wide panes that let in natural light, and the once dusty workbench converted into a welcoming reception desk. The Buick Skylark remained where it always had, but now surrounded by chairs, plants, and bookshelves, it had become the centerpiece of the story. Eleanor never moved it. She believed some symbols should remain untouched. The transformation wasn't just cosmetic. The space now thrummed with activity. A small tech station lined one wall, where volunteers taught seniors how to navigate digital platforms for job searches. Another corner held tables stacked with resumes in progress, while a converted closet had become a makeshift counseling office where participants met with advisors to plan their re-entry into the workforce. What had begun as a quiet initiative had become a prototype, one that other communities were starting to replicate. A local news team filmed a segment that aired on the evening news under the headline, "From Widow's Garage to Oregon's Most Inspiring Job Center." Soon after, a regional paper published a feature on Eleanor's leadership and the Renew model. Eleanor declined several offers for interviews on national television, preferring to stay focused on what was happening within the walls she knew best. Despite the attention, she remained grounded in the practical. Every morning, she arrived early and brewed a pot of coffee, reviewed progress notes, and walked the property line, inspecting the adjacent land that Richard had discreetly rezoned years before. She planned to expand there, but she wanted to do it right. Slowly. Intentionally. One Thursday morning, Eleanor welcomed her 50th program participant, a 71-year-old man named Robert Delaney, who had worked as a machinist for nearly 4 decades before his factory closed. He arrived with a baseball cap in hand and a nervous look on his face. "You sure I'm not too late for all this?" he asked. She smiled. "You're right on time." Robert was matched with 2 retired engineers volunteering through the program. Within a month, he was mentoring younger workers in a local technical college's night program. Eleanor sat with him one evening in the refurbished lounge area. He was recounting a story about rebuilding an old engine, his voice animated, his hands drawing invisible diagrams in the air. "Funny how life circles back, isn't it?" he said. "I used to train apprentices who had no clue how to hold a wrench. And now I'm back to doing the same thing. Just with more gray hair." "You never really stopped being a teacher," she replied. He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't think I ever stopped being useful. I just forgot what that felt like." Later that night, Eleanor stood alone in the garage, watching the last few staff members finish up their tasks. Rachel passed by with an armful of flyers for an upcoming community job fair the center was co-hosting. "We'll need to think about space soon," Rachel said. "We're maxed out on scheduling, and the list of applicants is growing every day." "I've already started the blueprints for the expansion," Eleanor said. "Richard left several drafts. We just need permits." "We'll get them," Rachel said. "People want this to grow." Eleanor walked outside as the last car pulled away, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The air was crisp, scented with wood smoke from nearby chimneys and damp leaves scattered along the sidewalks. Across the yard stood the adjacent lot, half an acre of untamed grass and weeds. She walked to the edge and imagined it. A full learning center. A cafe staffed by older adults re-entering food service. Classrooms, counseling rooms, open spaces for gatherings, maybe even a garden maintained by volunteers. Back inside, she opened a new binder labeled Expansion, Phase 2, and began sketching ideas. She had no architectural training, but she didn't need it. She had lived long enough to understand what made spaces feel safe, useful, and human. The next day, a woman named Lorraine entered the center holding a crumpled folder and looking like she might bolt at any moment. Eleanor sat with her near the coffee table and let her speak. Lorraine had been a bookkeeper for most of her adult life, laid off 5 years ago. Her confidence had dwindled after repeated rejection. She lived alone, had stopped attending family gatherings, and hadn't updated her resume in over a decade. Eleanor offered her the same promise she gave every participant: "You are not starting over. You are continuing forward." A volunteer named Carla worked with Lorraine over the next few weeks. By December, Lorraine was managing the accounting records for the center itself. The momentum kept building. A small nonprofit from Seattle requested Eleanor's permission to adopt the Renew model. A law school professor asked to use the legal case surrounding the program as a case study for an upcoming ethics seminar. Eleanor approved both. One morning, while sorting mail, she found a hand-addressed envelope from the governor's office. Inside was an invitation to a recognition event for state innovators in social impact. She placed the invitation on her desk and didn't answer it right away. She had never done this for awards. She wasn't finished yet. In the Garage Turn Center, The walls had slowly filled with framed photos of participants, before and after shots, smiling faces beside certificates of completion, resumes newly printed, hands holding coffee at group gatherings. The space had become a living archive of the very thing Richard believed in, dignity reclaimed. A small group of college students asked permission to film a short documentary on the center. Eleanor hesitated, but ultimately agreed, so long as they focused not on her, but on the participants. "I want people to see what's possible," she told them. Not who started it. During filming, they interviewed Lorraine, Robert, and a few of the early volunteers. One man, a retired school counselor named Ed, summed it up best when he looked into the camera and said, "We didn't come here to be saved. We came here to matter again." That line would later become the tagline on the Renew website. That winter, as snow dusted the edges of the yard and frost crept over the Skylark's windshield, Eleanor stood once more at the garage entrance, now fitted with a new sign above the door, "The Renew Center, BST by Eleanor Whitman." She hadn't chosen the wording, Rachel had surprised her with it, but she didn't ask for it to be changed. She allowed herself, finally, to be part of the story's title. Because now it wasn't just Richard's vision or her duty. It was hers, too. The first time Eleanor saw Brandon again was on a quiet Thursday in early spring. The trees along the sidewalk bordering the property were just beginning to bloom, pink blossoms swaying gently in the breeze. The light was soft, and the center was running on the steady pulse of its new routine: morning workshops, drop-in counseling, volunteer coordination. Eleanor had just stepped out of a meeting with a city representative about expanding public transit access to the center when she spotted him. He stood at the edge of the driveway in a worn blazer and khaki slacks, his shoulders drawn in, hands tucked into his pockets. He looked smaller than she remembered, not physically, but in presence. The sharpness he had once wielded like armor was dulled now, his face gaunt, his eyes ringed with the kind of tired that sleep didn't fix. Eleanor didn't say anything at first. She watched him as he took a hesitant step closer, then stopped again. He seemed unsure if he had the right to keep walking. "I read the article in Community Forward," he said quietly when she finally approached him. "The one about your expansion? And the program you're building?" She nodded, arms crossed over her chest, not cold, just measured. "It's not mine anymore. Not entirely. It belongs to the people who are building it now." Brandon looked down, then back up at her. "You did it. I did what your father started. And what I was meant to finish." He didn't respond. The wind moved between them, carrying the faint hum of conversation from inside the center, the clink of coffee cups, the shuffle of movement and work. Life was moving forward in there. No one was waiting for permission. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "Then why are you here?" "I lost the house," he said. "Sold it off to cover the legal costs. I live in a one-bedroom now. No furniture. No job. You should have thought about that before you tried to destroy something you never took the time to understand." "I know," he said. "That's why I came. Not for forgiveness. Just to see what he gave you, what he gave us." Eleanor stood in silence for a long moment. She wasn't angry, not anymore. But the ache was still there. The betrayal. The memory of hearing her own son call her a useless old woman. That didn't disappear just because he was standing in front of her now looking defeated. "You're not a child, Brandon," she said. "You made choices. And you'll live with them, like I did mine." "I've made a mess of everything," he said, almost a whisper. "And I don't know how to fix it." She studied him. For the first time in years, she didn't see the version of Brandon shaped by ambition or greed. She saw the one who used to lie on her lap and ask her to read the same bedtime story 3 times in a row. She saw the boy who cried when he thought their dog had run away. She saw the man who had failed, but maybe, just maybe, wasn't finished. "Come with me," she said. He followed her through the main entrance, where a few participants waved politely. Eleanor led him past the classrooms, past the job placement board and the coffee counter, until they reached a small multipurpose room near the back. It was quiet there, sun filtering in through large windows. "Sit," she said. He did. She pulled a folder from a filing cabinet labeled Legacy Inquiries, Internal Only, and set it on the table in front of him. "I created this 6 weeks ago. I wasn't sure who it would be for. Maybe someone like you. Maybe not. But it's for people who've lost their way and need to rebuild from nothing. Not as punishment. As healing." He opened the folder. Inside were intake forms, mentorship opportunities, and a personal statement page that read, "Tell us what you regret, and what you're still willing to fight for." Brandon looked up. "You'd let me be part of this?" "I'd let you earn it," she said. He swallowed, nodded once, then twice more. "I don't deserve it." "No," she agreed. "But it's not about what we deserve. It's about what we do next." That night, after the center had emptied out, Eleanor sat in her office at the back of the garage. The original safe was still there, now used more symbolically than functionally. Above it hung Richard's blueprint, framed. She looked at the empty seat across from her, then at the chair Brandon had sat in hours earlier. She didn't know what would come of his return. She wasn't foolish enough to expect an overnight change. But the beginning was there. Later, as the moon rose high and the neighborhood fell quiet, she walked to the small memorial plaque just beyond the edge of the property, placed in the soil where Richard used to plant his tomatoes. The plaque read, "To the man who saw beyond the walls." She knelt, touched the edge of the stone. "I kept going," she whispered. "Even when I didn't think I could." A breeze lifted the edges of her shawl. Somewhere in the distance, a bus hissed to a stop, and footsteps echoed down the street. Life moving on. Inside, the center lights flickered off one by one, timers doing their job. But Eleanor stayed a little longer, seated beneath the soft light of a single desk lamp, reviewing a grant proposal from a city 3 counties away that wanted to replicate the model. By the time she stood to leave, her body ached, but her heart was light. She turned off the lamp, locked the door, and looked back once more. The garage that had once been a symbol of isolation was now the beating heart of something much larger. A second life for those who had believed they'd reached their last chapter. And for her, for Eleanor Whitman, it was never really about inheritance. It was about reclamation. Of purpose. Of voice. Of hope. The story hadn't ended in loss. It had begun with it. But it ended in dignity. In legacy. In truth.